Distress signals had been broadcasting for 6 hours before the Galactic Council fleet arrived in the Veret system. Fleet Admiral Saravel stood on the command deck of the Council warship Eternal Accord, watching the main screen fill with data. She was a tall Dratari with pale blue skin and 4 narrow eyes that moved independently when she was thinking deeply. At the moment, all 4 eyes were moving. The data coming from the Veret system was disheartening. The colony on Veret 4 was burning. Saravel could see the heat signatures from orbit. Hundreds of structures on the surface were throwing heat plumes into the cold atmosphere. The colony was peaceful, consisting mostly of Krell farmers and a small population of Tuvari traders. They had been there for 3 generations. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply been in the wrong part of the galaxy when the Vorai decided they needed new frontier territories. "Admiral," said her tactical officer, a young Dratari named Vita, "I am tracking 14 Vorai ships in low orbit around Veret 4. Another 6 are positioned on the outer edge of the system. They appear to be conducting a blockade." Saravel nodded slowly. "What is the status of the colony?" The estimated population on the surface was 40 at last registration. Sensors show heat signatures consistent with heavy weapons fire. Many of the eastern settlements are no longer responding to communication pings. Vita paused. He was young and still found it difficult to keep his voice steady when the news was grim. Casualties among the civilian population are estimated to be high. Admiral Saravel closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at the rest of the bridge crew. They were all looking at her. They wanted to know the plan. She wished she had a better plan to give them. The Council fleet she commanded was not small. She had 11 warships, 2 heavy cruisers, and a carrier loaded with fighters against 14 Vorai ships in defensive orbit, plus 6 more at the system's edge. These numbers provided no comfort. The Vorai built their ships thick and ferocious. Their hulls were heavy, and their weapons were powerful. They did not care much for elegance or speed. They liked to hit hard and not die. "Open a communication channel with the Vorai flagship," Saravel ordered. The Tuvari communications officer, Peel, worked at his console for a moment. "Channel is open, Admiral." Saravel stood straight and maintained a calm, firm voice. "Vorai Fleet Command. This is Fleet Admiral Saravel of the Galactic Council. You are violating the Veret Neutrality Accord, which your government signed 40 years ago. You are ordered to cease all hostile actions. Retreat from Veret's orbit and power down your weapons. Any further damage to the colony or its population will be treated as an open act of war against the Council. Respond." There was a long silence. Then a voice returned, deep, gravelly, and completely unimpressed. "Fleet Admiral, you have arrived with 11 warships. We have 20. Your neutrality treaty is a piece of old paper. Veret is now Vorai territory. Leave or you will be destroyed along with the colony." The channel cut off. Saravel's jaw tightened. She had expected this, but hearing it still made something cold stir in her chest. The Vorai had been pushing borders for 12 years. This was just the latest nudge, and the Council, with all its committees, votes, and long formal debates, had never been good at stopping such nudges before they became something worse. "Admiral," said her sensor officer, a quiet man named Dos, "I am tracking an unusual energy signature on the outer edge of the system, beyond the blockade line." Saravel frowned. "Define unusual." "I don't know how to define it, Admiral. The energy pattern does not match any engine signature in our database." Doss tapped his console several times, as if convinced he was making a mistake and a recheck would fix it. "It is very large. The energy output far exceeds that of our engines, and it is moving fast, very fast." "Vorai reinforcements?" "No, Admiral. The Vorai are tracking it too. Their outer blockade ships have shifted into a defensive formation. I believe they don't know what it is either." This was strange enough that Saravel stepped closer to the main display. She stared at the long-range sensor feed. The outer Vorai ship's 6 heavy warships, each superior to 2 of her own cruisers, had broken their blockade pattern and turned to face the incoming signature. This meant they were worried. The Vorai were not easily worried. "How large is the contact?" she asked. Doss checked his readings again, then checked them a 3rd time. When he looked up, there was an expression on his face that Saravel had never seen before. "Admiral, the object appears to be approximately 11 kilometers long." No one on the bridge spoke. Saravel could hear her own breathing in the silence. 11 kilometers. The largest warship in the Galactic Council fleet was the Eternal Accord herself, and she was 900 meters long. That was considered huge. That was considered a statement of power. 11 kilometers was not a warship. 11 kilometers was something else. 11 kilometers was something that should not exist. Vita, she said carefully, what is the largest ship in the Vorai fleet? Their flagship carrier, Admiral, the Unbroken Hammer. Its length is approximately 1.4 kilometers. 1.4 kilometers versus 11. Saravel stared at the display and said nothing. The energy signature was growing stronger now. The sensor feed updated every few seconds, and every update showed the same thing. A massive object approaching the outer edge of the Veret system at a speed that should not be possible for something of that size. Most large ships sacrificed speed for mass. It was simple physics. You could not have both. But this thing was doing both, and doing it without apparent difficulty. The sensor officer continued to check his instruments, as if searching for an error that would make it all make sense. No error appeared. The outer Vorai ships are broadcasting a warning signal, Peel said from the comms console. They are ordering the contact to identify itself and stop. The contact is responding. Not yet, Admiral. The Vorai ships moved again, this time turning to attack. Saravel knew this formation well. It was what the Vorai did when they intended to shoot first and ask questions later. They had started with this formation in 3 other border systems over the last decade. It usually ended with the other side being left in pieces. She watched as the formation completed on the display. Then she watched as the massive contact dropped out of superluminal travel. There was a flash on the long-range visual feed. Not a small flash, not the kind a ship makes when exiting FTL as engine energy dissipates. This flash was wide and bright. It took 3 full seconds to fade. When it faded, the main display updated, and the visual sensors were finally able to see something, not just energy readings. The bridge went completely silent. What hung in space on the outer edge of the Veret system was not a ship in the sense of the word Saravel understood. It was a structure. It was a massive, dark, angular structure that spanned the visual feed in such a way that she felt small. Just looking at it, it resembled a blade, long and narrow in the front, widening toward the rear into a series of massive sections that were clearly separate hull segments. The hull itself was dark gray, almost black, with rows of running lights across the surface that, from a distance, looked like stars in a very orderly night sky. Weapons were visible even at a great distance, rows and rows of them, positioned along the top and bottom surfaces, which were apparently launch bays. Not 1 or 2, but dozens, arranged in columns along both sides of the main hull. And at the stern were propulsion systems that still glowed from the FTL transit, each larger than several Council destroyers stacked together. 11 kilometers of dark metal, floating in space, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, watching. Admiral, Vita said, his voice having lost all its practiced steadiness, the outer Vorai ships are charging weapons. Of course they are, Saravel said quietly. She could not take her eyes off the display. What is our status? Our weapons are on standby, waiting for your order. She said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about something that had crossed her mind when she looked at the enormous vessel. It wasn't shooting. The Vorai had moved to attack and charged weapons, and the massive vessel was doing nothing. It had simply arrived. It was simply present. It seemed to be waiting. "Dos," she said. "Is the contact scanning us?" Dos checked. "Yes, Admiral. Active scanning, very thorough. Whatever this is, it seems to be gathering detailed information on everything in this system, including the colony, the Vorai ships, and us." He paused. "Admiral, the level of detail the scan is capturing exceeds anything our own sensors can produce. Whatever equipment this vessel is carrying, it is significantly more advanced than ours." Saravel absorbed this. Advanced sensors, enormous size, speed that defied its own mass, and an absence of aggression. So far, it had arrived in a system full of warships aimed at each other, and it had simply stopped and started reading everything around it like a scientist who had just entered a library. "PL," she said. "Is the contact transmitting a signal on any frequency?" "No, Admiral. It is receiving." It received the Vorai warning message, but did not respond. "And did it direct any signal specifically toward our fleet?" PL worked at his console. "Not yet, Admiral." Saravel watched the outer Vorai ships. They were still in attack formation, still charged, but they were not firing. She wondered what was stopping them. It could be uncertainty. It could be a simple, very basic animal instinct that even hardened Vorai warriors seemed to possess, an instinct that said with something this big and this quiet, one might not want to start a fight. Or it could be something else, something simpler. The outer Vorai commander might simply be waiting to be told what this was before deciding if it was worth shooting. That was the question everyone in the system was asking now. What is it? Saravel turned to her tactical display and opened the Universal Council registry. Every known species in the galactic community had its ships cataloged. Every known engine signature, every hull configuration, every known size class. She launched a search parameter, 11 kilometers in length. Engine signature that DOS had recorded. Angular hull configuration from the visual feed. The registry searched. The registry returned no results. She ran it again with wider parameters. Any ship within 50% of that length, any engine signature within 40% of the readings, any species known for its FTL technologies not currently registered as a council member. The registry returned no results. She leaned back and stared at the empty results screen, and then she looked at the enormous black shape on the visual feed and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt sincere, profound curiosity mixed with a hint of fear. "Admiral," Vita said, breaking the silence. "The outer Vorai command ship is calling the contact again. Direct, narrow beam transmission. This time, they are demanding identification by military code. The contact is responding. A pause. No, Admiral. Another pause. Admiral, the contact is moving." Saravel snapped her eyes back to the display. The huge vessel was indeed moving not toward the Vorai, but across the outer edge, slowly and deliberately moving in a wide arc that clearly led it to a better angle on the Veret system, a better angle on Veret 4, a better view of the colony, the burning settlements, and the Vorai ships in low orbit. It was repositioning. It was choosing its position. And something about this calm, leisurely way of acting made all four of Saravel's eyes focus in one direction simultaneously, which almost never happened unless she was very, very concerned. "How long will it take to complete this arc?" she asked. "At current speed? Approximately 7 minutes. 7 minutes. In 7 minutes, this huge vessel would be between the burning colony on Veret 4 and the Vorai fleet that was currently orbiting it. Not between Saravel's fleet and the Vorai, between the colony and the Vorai." She looked at the display for a long time. Then she said something she hadn't intended to say. "I think," she said quietly, "that it is here because of the colony." No one argued with her. No one could think of anything better. So they all looked at the display, and they watched as the huge, dark vessel completed its arc. And they watched as the outer Vorai ships finally broke formation and retreated. Not because someone had ordered them to, and not because they were threatened, but because 20 years of combat experience apparently told every Vorai commander in this system the same thing at the same time. Whatever this was, one did not get between it and what it was focused on. The outer Vorai ships retreated to join the main fleet in the orbit of Veret 4, and the huge vessel took up its new position. Saravel watched as the running lights slowly moved across its hull on the visual feed, and she found herself thinking, not for the first time in the last 20 minutes, where did it come from? Who built it? What species looked at the scale of this galaxy and said, "We need something bigger"? She had no answers. She had a hunch that answers were coming. She had a hunch that they would be very, very interesting. Her communication console lit up. PL turned from his seat with an expression Saravel had never seen on a Tuvari before. Wide eyes, slightly trembling hands, his voice careful and precise, like people when they are trying very hard not to show how amazed they are. "Admiral," PL said, "the unknown vessel is transmitting a signal, galactic standard, clear signal, directed at all vessels in the system." Saravel straightened in her command chair. "Put it through," she said. The voice that emerged from the bridge speakers was calm. It was level. It belonged to someone who breathed air and spoke with a jaw, a tongue, and vocal cords, meaning it was a biological creature, not a machine. And it carried that particular quality that certain voices have, the quality of a person who was not in a hurry because they did not need to be in a hurry, because nothing in the immediate environment posed a threat to them. "This is Commander Pak Jin-ho of the United Nations ship Aegis Terra." The voice addressed all vessels in the Veret system. "We are aware of the situation on the surface. We are here for observation. We request all parties to maintain their current positions. We will be in contact shortly." The transmission ended. The bridge was very quiet. Saravel looked at PL. "Run that name through all our databases." PL complied. "No results, Admiral. No matches in any known registry. No matches in any language database. The structure of the name is unrecognizable." Saravel nodded. She had expected this. She looked at the huge, dark vessel on the display. Aegis Terra. She did not know what it meant. She did not know what a United Nations ship was, or what Terra meant, or who Commander Pak Jin-ho was, or what species spoke with a voice like that, stable, warm, and completely, utterly fearless. She knew one thing. Whatever happened next, the Veret system had just become the most important place in the galaxy, and she had a hunch it would stay that way for a very, very long time. The silence after the transmission lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then everyone on the Eternal Accord bridge started talking at once, and Fleet Admiral Saravel had to raise her voice sharply to cut through it all. The crew fell silent, but one could see it in their posture. The tension, the confusion, the nervous energy coming from being in the middle of something nobody understood. She understood the feeling. She shared it, but she was an admiral, and being an admiral meant she could not show it. "Vita," she said, keeping her voice level. "Full sensor scan of the contact. Everything we have. Hull composition, weapon count, life sign readings. Everything. Already working on it, Admiral. PL, connect me to the Council High Command channel. Priority channel. Level 1 encryption. Opening line, Admiral. Dose. I want that engine signature analyzed. I want to know if it matches anything at all in any database we carry on this ship. Cross-analyze with old records, pre-council records, theoretical ship design models. Everything." "Yes, Admiral." She turned back to the main display and studied the huge vessel. It hadn't moved since the transmission. It sat at the edge of the system in its chosen position. Running lights slowly traced steady patterns along its hull. The propulsion systems were cooling to a dull glow. It looked, if such a word could be applied to something 11 kilometers long covered in weapons patient. It looked as if it was comfortable waiting. That in itself was interesting. Most ships arriving in a contested system with that much firepower did not position themselves and wait. They either moved to assert dominance immediately or kept at a safe distance. This ship had done something different. It had taken a specific position that made it a clear obstacle between the Vorai fleet and the colony on Veret 4, and then it stopped, calmly introduced itself, and told everyone to hold their positions. That was the behavior of something that had a plan and was in no rush to execute it. The Vorai, for their part, were doing something Saravel rarely saw. They were holding. The 20 Vorai ships were still in formation around Veret 4 and at the outer edge, but they were not attacking, they were not advancing, they were not sending another warning message. They sat at their positions, and presumably, they were looking at their own sensor feeds and trying to understand what they were seeing, just like everyone else. Vite finished the initial sensor scan and turned with his report. "Admiral, the hull composition on the contact is partially readable. The outer layer appears to be a metal alloy composite not in our material database. The density is significantly higher than standard hull plating, roughly 3 times the density of our best armor composites. There is also what looks like an energy field covering the hull, a non-standard shield configuration. The geometry is different. Weapon count?" Vita hesitated. "This is where reading gets difficult, Admiral. I can identify clear weapon mounts along the top and bottom of the hull. I count over 200 individual mounts. However, there are additional structures that I cannot classify. They could be additional types of weapons we don't recognize, or they could be support systems. I cannot say with certainty." He paused again. "The launch bays I can count clearly. There are 48, Admiral. Each bay appears large enough to hold several craft. 200 weapon mounts, 48 launch bays on one ship." Saravel processed this. "Life sign readings are real, but unusual. The life sign configuration suggests a biological crew, oxygen-consuming, carbon-based biology consistent with several known types of species, but the density is low for such a large ship. I am reading approximately 6,000 life signs along the length of the vessel, 6,000 on an 11-kilometer ship. The Eternal Accord carried 800 crew members on a 900-meter ship. If scaled strictly by volume, a ship the size of the Aegis Terra should carry tens of thousands, unless the ship was heavily automated, unless the crew was small by design, managing systems too advanced to need many hands. "The Council High Command is on the line," Admiral Peel announced. Saravel walked to the encrypted communication terminal and pressed the contact point. The face that appeared on the small screen belonged to High Counselor Dawn, an old Dratari, silver blue, with the carefully calculated facial expression of a man who had held political office long enough to master the art of looking calm while being anything but. "Admiral," Dawn said, "we are receiving your sensor data in real time. This vessel, you have no identification for it?" None, Counselor. It is not listed in any registry. Its engine signature is unknown. The hull composition does not match any material in our database. The commander identified himself by name and gave the ship the designation Aegis Terra. But neither the name nor the designation matches any known species or civilization. Counselor Don's expression did not change, but one of his eyes shifted very slightly, an involuntary sign that Dratari politicians never quite managed to eliminate. He was more shocked than he looked. And its current position? Stationary, no weapons fire, no aggressive movements. It took a position between the Vorai and the colony, but after the transmission, it has taken no further actions. And the Vorai are holding position. They look uncertain, Counselor. Don paused. He looked somewhere behind the screen, then returned. Admiral, your current orders remain in effect. Defend the colony, but exercise significant caution regarding this unknown vessel. Do not provoke it. Do not approach it without additional information, and find out what it is. Yes, Counselor. The line closed. Saravel turned back to the bridge. Dos, anything from the database? Cross-reference? The sensor officer looked up from his work, and the expression he wore was one Saravel would remember for a long time. It was the expression of a careful, methodical, experienced person who had just found something that didn't fit into any of the categories he had been building his entire career. Admiral, I found something, but I must warn you that what I found is very old and not from the official database. Show me. Dos transferred the data to her command display. It was an old record, pre-council, meaning it was at least 300 years old. It came from the archival records of a small Krell reconnaissance fleet that had apparently ventured into a region of space far beyond the current mapped area. The record was fragmentary and poorly preserved, but it had a description that had triggered Doss's search query. She read it. The Krell scout reported the detection at extreme range of what it described as a moving structure of impossible size. The scout did not approach. The scout recorded the observation, then spent 3 paragraphs explaining why it had turned around and gone home. The energy signature it described did not match exactly with what they were reading now, but it was close enough for Doss's search to flag it. At the bottom of the record was a note added by a Krell archivist later, which read, "Testimony of the scout captain reviewed and filed. No supporting evidence. No subsequent expeditions conducted. Classification unconfirmed." 300 years ago, Saravel said quietly, more to herself than anyone on the bridge. They were out there. It appears so, Admiral, Doss said. Perhaps longer. The scout record is the oldest I found. But if they have been traveling beyond the mapped regions for this long, they could have been active much earlier and simply never crossed paths with anyone who filed a report or anyone who survived to file a report. Saravel thought, but she kept the thought to herself. The Vorai moved. Not all of them. The main fleet in the orbit of Veret 4 stayed put. But the 6 ships that had initially formed the outer blockade line began to move slowly, deliberately toward the Aegis Terra. They were not in full attack formation. They were in a probing formation, the kind the Vorai used when they wanted to get close enough to properly read a target before engaging. The outer Vorai ships are moving toward the contact, Vita confirmed. They appear to be conducting a close approach for sensor purposes. What is the contact doing? Nothing. Still stationary, Admiral. The 6 Vorai ships slowly approached. At a distance of 300 kilometers from the Aegis Terra, they slowed. Saravel watched as their sensor emissions intensified on the display. They were scanning, doing the same thing she was, trying to understand what this thing was. Then, one of the Vorai ships did something very Vorai-like. It fired a remote shot, not a full weapon discharge, just one pulse from a nose cannon. Something the Vorai sometimes did when they weren't sure if something was a threat or an abandoned object. Fire a small shot and see if it reacts. The pulse crossed the gap and struck the hull of the Aegis Terra, and nothing happened. No explosion, no visible damage, no hole in the hull, no secondary explosion from impacted systems. The energy pulse simply stopped when it reached the hull. It didn't even leave a visible mark, as if the ship simply absorbed the shot and processed it like a large animal processes the bite of a small insect without visible effect, without visible concern. The 6 Vorai ships stopped. There was a very long pause in the Veret system. Then, the Aegis Terra spoke again to the Vorai ship that had fired the remote shot. The voice of Commander Pak Jin-ho said, "That was unnecessary. We are not here because of you. We are here because of the colony. We suggest you return to your formation and wait. This will be resolved shortly." The transmission ended. One of the Vorai ships began backing away from the Aegis Terra, then the second, then the third. By the end, all 6 outer ships were moving back toward the main fleet, and no one watching them could say they were doing it in an orderly fashion. They were doing it the way ships retreat when a crew has collectively and without formal order decided that being where they were was a very bad idea. On the Eternal Accord bridge, someone let out a long, shaky sigh. Saravel did not look to see who it was. She felt she understood. "Admiral," Peel said, and his voice was now very careful. "The Aegis Terra is calling us directly. Narrow beam, addressed specifically to this ship." Saravel stood very straight. On the speakers, the same calm voice. "Admiral Saravel, this is Commander Pak from the Aegis Terra. We have reviewed the situation in this system. We understand you are here on behalf of the Galactic Council to deal with the Vorai invasion. We would like to coordinate actions. Are you ready to speak directly?" Saravel looked at her crew. They were looking at her. On every face was the same question. What do we do? She didn't have a manual for this. There was no council protocol for an unknown ship of impossible size asking to coordinate actions against a common threat. There was no training exercise that covered this scenario. There was just the situation and herself and her judgment. She pressed the button to open the channel. "Commander Pak, this is Admiral Saravel. We are ready to speak. Before we continue, I must ask, who are you? Where are you from? Your vessel and your name appear in no registry to which I have access." A brief pause, then the voice again. And now there was something in it, something very light, almost imperceptible that could have been quiet amusement. "Admiral, we are humans. We are from a planet called Earth. We are aware we are not in your registry. That is something we have been meaning to address for some time." Another small pause. "We think this situation might be a good occasion for that." Admiral Saravel leaned back in her command chair and stared at the huge dark vessel on the display, trying to find an answer for this. "Human," she said finally, mostly to herself, testing the word. It was not a word in any language she knew, which meant it was a translation of something from their own language, Earth. "Yes, Admiral," the voice said, and it was definitely patient, very, very patient. "We will explain everything. We ask you to hold your fleet's position for now and let us resolve the Vorai problem. We think we can resolve it without unnecessary casualties on any side." Saravel looked at the Vorai fleet on the display. 20 warships, a burning colony, 40 people still stuck on the surface. She looked at the Aegis Terra. She thought about the remote shot from the Vorai scout ship, the shot that did nothing. She thought about the 6 Vorai warships retreating from a single vessel without being fired upon. "Commander Pak, the Council fleet will hold position. We are watching." "Understood, Admiral, thank you." The channel closed. Saravel sat in the chair and watched the huge ship, thinking about everything she didn't know. She thought about the old Krell scout record and what it meant that something this big had been operating beyond the mapped regions for at least 300 years. She thought about the word human. She thought about the planet Earth, which was on no map she had ever seen. She thought about the 6,000 lives aboard a ship built like a world, and what kind of people built something like that and why. After 300 years or more of observing from the dark, they had decided today was the day to step forward. She was still thinking about all this when the main Vorai fleet finally made its next move, and that was when everything truly started. The invitation arrived 20 minutes after the last transmission. A short, clear message addressed to the Eternal Accord from the Aegis Terra, signed by Commander Pak Jin-ho, suggesting a small delegation from the Council fleet might wish to come aboard for a direct meeting. It indicated that a shuttle bay on the port side of the vessel, approximately at the midpoint of the hull, would be provided. It included approach coordinates, accurate enough for Saravel's navigation officer to plot a course without any calculations. The bridge crew looked at Admiral Saravel. She looked at the coordinates. She looked at the huge vessel. She looked at the Vorai fleet, which was still holding position in orbit of Veret, and in the last 20 minutes had not fired again on the colony, which in itself was remarkable. She was not sure if the Vorai were waiting to see what the strange ship would do, or waiting for a better chance, or simply doing what everyone else in the system was doing, watching. She made a decision. She took Vita, her tactical officer, Dos, her sensor officer, PL, her communications officer, and a security escort of 4 soldiers, and ordered a shuttle prepared. She thought about informing Council High Command before leaving, but decided it would take too long, and the counselor would likely tell her not to go, which was not an instruction she was prepared to follow now. The shuttle left the Eternal Accord and crossed the gap between the 2 ships. Saravel sat in the front passenger seat and watched the Aegis Terra grow in the shuttle's viewport. From a distance, it was enormous. Up close, as they approached and the scale resolved from sensors and data into something she could actually familiar with her own eyes, it was something entirely different. The hull was not smooth. It had texture. Deep channels and recessed sections ran along its length, and as the shuttle flew alongside the middle section of the hull, she saw that many of these recessed areas contained additional systems. What looked like secondary sensor arrays, communication antennas, and in a few places, what looked like access points for repair or maintenance large enough to fly a medium-sized transport through. The metal itself was dark, almost black in the shadow of the ship's own mass. But where starlight hit at the right angle, it had a quality of its own. A faint structural pattern in the alloy, like something that was built to last, not just for the mission it was currently on. Very long. The shuttle found the specified bay. The doors were already open. 2 massive armored doors, each larger than the entire deck space of the Eternal Accord shuttles, slid apart, revealing a lit interior. Inside the bay, there was enough space to park 15 Council fleet shuttles side by side with room to spare. It was clean, well lit with warm white light that seemed intentional. And as they descended and landed on the deck, Saravel saw a small group of waiting figures, humans. She tried to prepare herself for this moment during the flight on the shuttle. She thought about what she might see. A species that had never contacted the galactic community. Perhaps something completely different from anything she knew. She hardened herself to the unexpected. She did not expect to see something so close to the familiar. There were 6 figures standing on the deck as the shuttle ramp lowered. They were bipedal, with 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. The head was proportionally distinct from the Dratari, smaller, rounder, with eyes facing forward, which suggested that at some point in their evolutionary history, they needed to judge distance well. The eyes were different colors. 2 figures had dark eyes, 1 had pale eyes, 1 had eyes in a shade between brown and amber. They had no scales. Their skin was smooth and came in shades from very light to deep warm brown. Compared to most Dratari, they were quite compact, not taller on average, not long-limbed, but carried themselves in a way that conveyed something. It was the same way certain commanders of all species carried themselves, straight, alert, and completely confident. The one in front was slightly taller than the others. He wore a dark, tight-fitting uniform with markings on the collar and sleeve that Saravel assumed were rank insignias. His hair was dark and short-cropped. His face was calm. His eyes, when they met hers as she came down the shuttle ramp, were steady, dark brown, and they held the same quality she had heard in his voice on the comms channel. Not aggressive, not boastful, not wary, just present. He stepped forward and extended one hand toward her, palm open, in a gesture that she searched her memory for something like a greeting gesture used by several species she knew, meaning no weapons, no threat. "Admiral Saravel," he said. His galactic standard was perfect, better than perfect. It had a natural quality, as if he had been speaking it for years. "I am Commander Pak Jin-ho, of the United Nations ship Aegis Terra. Thank you for coming." She hesitated only briefly before responding with a gesture, touching his fingers. It seemed to be what the gesture required. His handshake was firm, then he let go. "Commander Pak, thank you for the invitation." She looked at him closely. "Your galactic standard is very good." "We have had time to study it," he said. That same lightness in his voice again, the same almost amusement she had heard before. "Please, walk with me. There is a briefing room where we can talk. I assume you have many questions." That, she thought, is a significant understatement. He smiled. It was the first smile she had seen clearly enough to read. It changed his face, made it warmer and more open. She had seen this smile on Dratari, on Krell, on Tuvari. It seemed that whatever else humans were, they were something that smiled. She followed him through the bay doors into the interior of the Aegis Terra. The corridors were wide, not absurdly wide, but comfortably wide. Enough that 6 or 7 people could walk shoulder to shoulder without bumping. The ceilings were high. The lighting was even and warm. On the walls were inscriptions in a script she did not recognize, presumably in the human's own language and under each sign, in Galactic Standard. She noticed that when she looked at the translations in Galactic Standard, they were accurate, detailed. Not the kind of translation one gets from a crude dictionary, but the kind one gets from someone who genuinely understands the language. The crew they passed in the corridors looked at the delegation with open curiosity, but not with hostility. Saravel looked back. She saw variety again, different skin tones, different sizes, some taller, some shorter, hair of different shades and lengths. They all wore the same dark uniform. They all moved with a purpose and efficiency she recognized as the gait of trained military personnel. But there was something else in how they moved through this ship. Comfort, a sense of belonging. They were at home here, just as crew members were at home on a ship they had spent years on. Commander Pak led them into a briefing room, which, compared to the rest of the ship, was of modest size. There was a long table, chairs clearly designed for the proportions of the human body, but with adjustable sections that were apparently reconfigured for the proportions of the Dratari. She saw the adjustment marks, which meant they knew who was coming, which meant they had prepared. She found a seat. Pak sat opposite her. The other humans, clearly his officers, took seats at the table. Saravel's crew settled around her. "I will start with the obvious question," Saravel said, "because if I don't ask it first, I won't be able to focus on anything else. How long have you been in this galaxy?" Pak looked briefly at his officers. Something passed between them unspoken. Just a look. Then he turned back to Saravel. "Our species evolved on a planet called Earth in a star system we call Sol, located in the inner regions of the galaxy. We developed interstellar travel approximately 300 years ago by local calendar. Since then, we have explored, Saravel repeated. For 300 years without contact with known species? We have contacted several species, Pak said. Some of those contacts were not peaceful. We learned early that approaching unknown civilizations requires caution and time." He paused. "We have observed the galactic community for a significant part of those 300 years. We learned your languages, your histories, your political structures. We decided to wait until we felt we could interact productively." Saravel stared at him. "You observed us for 300 years and said nothing? While wars were being fought? While colonies were being seized? While the Vorai had been expanding their borders for 12 years? Pak's expression did not waver. He looked her confidently in the eyes. "We observed," he said, "and learned, and built." "Built what?" He looked at her for a moment, then simply said, "Ships." She thought about what that word meant in this context. 300 years of construction, 300 years of what those Krell scouts had seen from afar and decided not to approach. She thought about the sensor readings. Hull 3 times denser than the best armor in the Council's arsenal, 200 weapon mounts, 48 launch bays, 6,000 crew members managing an 1-kilometer-long ship. And this was one ship. "How many ships do you have?" she asked. Pak looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Admiral, before I answer that, I think there are things we should discuss regarding the current situation. There is still a burning colony in this system and a Vorai fleet in orbit around it." She recognized the answer as a deliberate delay. He wasn't going to answer that question. She set it aside for now and moved on. "What are your intentions regarding the Vorai?" "We intend to ask them to leave," Pak said. Saravel waited for more. There was no more. That was all. That is the first part. If they comply, no further action will be required. The colony will be assessed for the needs of the aid we are prepared to provide. The Council's authority over Veret will be recognized and supported. He folded his hands on the table. If they do not comply, the situation will require a different approach. But I would prefer to try conversation first. "The Vorai," Saravel said carefully, "usually react poorly to requests to do things they don't want to do." "I am aware," Pak said. "I have been reading your historical records for quite some time." Admiral Doss, sitting next to Saravel, leaned forward slightly and spoke for the first time since they had boarded. He was a careful, methodical man and asked careful, methodical questions. "Commander Pak, the energy discharge from the Vorai scout ship earlier when they fired the remote shot at your hull, you appeared to sustain no damage." Pak glanced at the sensor officer. "Correct. Can you explain the mechanism of that resistance?" Pak smiled again. Not the same smile as before. This was something else. More internal. "The composition of our hull and the geometry of our shields are the result of 300 years of development, Officer Doss. I will say that the shot the Vorai fired at us carried roughly the same energy power as what we would classify as a light pulse from defensive short-range weapons. It did not pose a significant threat to this vessel." Doss leaned back and absorbed this. Saravel watched the face of her sensor officer and saw him working through the consequences of what Pak had just said. The Vorai scout ships were not small vessels. The pulse from their nose cannon was not a small weapon. If that qualified as a light pulse from defensive short-range weapons by human classification standards, Then what did the Aegis Terra classify as a significant threat? She wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Commander," said Vita, the tactical officer, unable to help himself. "The weapon mounts along your hull. Can you tell me what class they are?" Pak looked at Vita. "We use several different systems," he said. "Kinetic rail drivers, energy weapons in several frequency bands, missile launch systems, and some systems I will not describe in detail at this time, Officer Vita. They are sufficient for our operational needs." Vita stared at him for a moment, then leaned back and said nothing. PL spoke next. The practical mind of the communications officer moved to a practical question. "Commander, you said you want to ask the Vorai to leave. You indicated that the Galactic Council's authority in this system would be supported. Does this mean you intend to act within the Council in the future?" Pak nodded. "That is our intention. Humanity's intention is not to displace or diminish the galactic community. Our intention is to join it." He paused. "As a full member, with everything that implies." Saravel looked at him. He looked back. She thought about all of it. 300 years. The ship inside which she was sitting, 6,000 crew members, weapons, a hull that absorbed a cannon shot as if it were nothing. She thought about the word member. She thought about what the Galactic Council would say, what the Vorai would say, what every species in the community would say when they processed the information that a civilization had existed in this galaxy for 3 centuries that none of them knew about. She thought about the carefully calculated expression of the High Counselor on her comm screen, and she thought that when she provided her full report, that expression would be somewhat harder to maintain. "I have one more question," she said. Pak waited. "Why now? Of all the moments in 300 years, why this system? Why this incident? Why today?" Pak remained silent for a moment. He looked at the table, then raised his eyes to her. When he spoke, his voice was still calm, still level, but there was something in it that hadn't been there before, something quieter and more serious. "Because there are 40 people on that surface," he said, "and they are dying, and we are here, and we can stop it, and there is no longer any sufficient reason to wait." The conference room was very quiet. Saravel looked at him for a long time. She thought about 300 years of observation. She thought about how much effort it took to observe and not act. She thought about what finally made that deterrent factor break. "All right," she said finally. "Then let's talk to the Vorai." Commander Pak Jin-ho nodded, and for the first time since her arrival, the patience in his behavior shifted to something more purposeful. He nodded once, and they went. The transmission to the Vorai fleet was sent from the Aegis Terra. At the same time, Saravel's delegation shuttle left the human ship to return to the Eternal Accord. Commander Pak had made it clear that the Council fleet should be back in formation before the message was sent. Saravel appreciated his focus, although she wasn't entirely sure she understood it until she returned to her command bridge and began watching events unfold on the main display. Pak had explained very calmly in the conference room what he was going to say to the Vorai. It didn't sound complicated. He said, "We will ask them to leave. We will give them a clear timeline. We will make the consequences of non-compliance clear, and we will mean everything we say." Saravel asked if he expected the Vorai to comply. Pak thought about it for a moment. "In my experience," he said, "people who have been winning for a long time need to see something very clearly before accepting that the situation has changed. We intend to show them that clearly." The transmission was sent. Saravel read the text feed when Peel brought it up on the bridge display, because she wanted to see exactly what the humans had said. It was short. "To Vorai Fleet Command. Veret System. This is Commander Pak Jin-ho, United Nations ship Aegis Terra. You are ordered to cease all hostile actions against the population of Veret 4. You are ordered to withdraw your fleet from this system within 2 standard hours. The colony is under the protection of the Galactic Council and, from this moment, under the protection of humanity. Non-compliance will result in the use of force. We recommend compliance. Commander Pak, UNS Aegis Terra." That was it. No long list of grievances, no political language, no committee phrasing. 2 standard hours. Get out. Non-compliance means force. Saravel watched the display and waited. The Vorai response took 8 minutes. She assumed it took the Vorai fleet commander some time to read the transmission and decide how to respond. She could imagine the debate aboard the Vorai flagship. She could imagine the officers looking at their own sensor feeds and looking at the Aegis Terra and arguing about what it was and what it could actually do, and whether the result of the remote shot was an anomaly or a real demonstration of what their weapons could not do against it. She could imagine the fleet commander at the end of all that making the same decision Vorai commanders had been making for 12 years in similar situations, that the object before them was an obstacle, and obstacles existed to be eliminated. The Vorai fleet moved. Not just the outer ships this time, all of them, all 20 warships, began to reform. And Vita read the changes in formation with the level voice of a trained officer who did not allow himself to show what he was thinking. The Vorai fleet is transitioning into full combat formation. Admiral, they are advancing on the Aegis Terra. Weapons are activated on all 20 vessels. Understood, Saravel said. What is the Aegis doing? Still stationary, Admiral. No visible reaction. 20 Vorai warships, the largest of which, the carrier Unbroken Hammer, was 1.4 kilometers long, were forming up and advancing on one ship. She wanted to call Pak and say something, although she wasn't sure what. Be careful. It seemed both insufficient and somewhat absurd. She decided to watch. The Vorai approached to a combat distance of 1,000 kilometers, which was the standard opening fire distance for the Vorai. They liked their weapons at that distance. Their nose batteries worked best there. She had seen what Vorai nose batteries did at 1,000 kilometers, and she had seen what was left of what they fired at, and the images were not comforting. The Vorai fleet opened fire. This was no longer a single shot or a probing discharge. This was a coordinated volley from 20 warships, calculated for simultaneous arrival, 20 nose batteries firing together, energy beams, heavy shells, missile volleys. Saravel had seen a similar combined barrage used against fortified positions that were supposed to withstand it. The positions had not withstood it. The volleys crossed the gap and arrived at the Aegis Terra. On the visual feed, for a moment, there was nothing but light. The joint energy of the nose batteries from 20 warships striking one hull created a visual event bright enough that the display sensors automatically dimmed the image to protect the optics. Then the light faded. The Aegis Terra was still there. It was completely, absolutely unharmed. No hole, no debris, no secondary explosions, no change in the running lights across its surface. The weapons had not shaken the vessel. They had not scratched the hull. They arrived, and the hull processed it. And there was nothing left but the fading light of dissipated energy. No one on the Eternal Accord bridge said anything. Saravel stared at the display and waited. For 3 seconds, the Aegis Terra did nothing. She thought about what those 3 seconds meant. She thought that perhaps this was when the humans decided the moment between receiving what another race decided to throw at you and deciding how to respond. She thought about what it was like to be a target, the best effort of 20 warships, and know that it didn't move you an inch. Then the Aegis Terra moved. It moved fast. The speed was wrong. For something of that size, something 11 kilometers long had no right to move like that, but it did. It crossed the combat distance in a time that left the Vorai fleet struggling to track it and recalculate fire solutions, while the target was already not where it had been. The Aegis moved laterally through the Vorai formation in a long, winding arc, and as it moved, it finally fired. Not with everything, not with 200 weapon mounts or whatever was in those unclassified mounts. Saravel watched the firing pattern on the display, and she could see, even from her position, even with the help of her own sensors, that the Aegis was acting selectively, precisely. The energy weapons it fired were aimed at specific places, on specific ships, engines. It was aiming at the engines. The first shot hit the flagship carrier, Unbroken Hammer, and the carrier's port propulsion system went out, not destroyed. The ship was not destroyed. There was no explosion, no hole. Just the propulsion system vanished, shut down. The carrier jerked to the side, no longer balanced by its own thrust. The next shot took out the engine of a Vorai heavy cruiser, then another cruiser, then 4 escort ships in a row so quickly that the targeting must have been partially automated. No human gunner could have obtained 4 solutions so quickly. In less than 20 seconds, 7 Vorai ships were dead in space. Not destroyed, not lost, simply stopped. Engines gone, still intact, still with live crews inside, still fully capable of everything except movement and escape. Saravel stared at the display. Vita, she said carefully. The Aegis is aiming at weapon systems, sensors, life support? No, Admiral, Vita said, and his voice was doing something she had never heard before. It had become quieter and slower, as if he was carefully choosing every word. Exclusively engines and propulsion systems on every ship it has hit so far. No crew casualties detected, no destruction of weapons, no damage to sensors, no structural hull damage. It is disabling them, Saravel said. Yes, Admiral. Specifically, it is making them unable to leave and maneuver. She sat with this for a moment. The Aegis had withstood a full combined barrage from 20 warships, and then entered the Vorai formation and begun methodically stripping them of their ability to go anywhere. It was not trying to destroy the fleet. It was trying to ground it. And in the process, it was demonstrating very clearly, very calmly, that it could have done otherwise at any moment and had chosen not to. The 13 remaining mobile Vorai ships were reacting now. Some were trying to maneuver away, some were trying to form a defensive cluster. 2 of them were still firing, although their shots at the Aegis were as effective as the first barrage, which was to say, not effective at all. The Aegis moved through the formation like something that knew exactly where every threat was and where every threat wasn't. And it fired when it needed to fire, and repositioned when it needed to reposition, and it seemed it was in no hurry. Then Saravel's display lit up with new contacts. Not Vorai, not Council fleet, new contacts. Several contacts exiting FTL at the outer edge of the Veret system, one after another. The same signature as the Aegis, the same massive energy bloom, the same engine profile, the same impossible scale. She watched as the contacts resolved one after another, while her sensors struggled to process them all. Admiral, Doss said, and his voice was very, very careful. I am now tracking. I am tracking additional human ships entering the system. I have counted 3, 6, 9. I have counted 12 additional contacts. Size class? She asked. Variable, Doss said. The smallest appear to be approximately 3 to 4 kilometers long. There are 3 ships in the 6 to 7 range, and 2 contacts that are larger than the Aegis, Admiral 14 to 15 kilometers. Saravel looked at her display and saw 12 enormous human warships positioning themselves along the outer edge of the Veret system. They were not approaching the battlefield. They took up position in a wide formation that effectively sealed the exits from the system. If anything in this system tried to leave via FTL, it would have to go through the human formation to do it. They were not joining the battle. They were ensuring that no one left. And Saravel realized at that moment, with a clarity that was almost physically uncomfortable. The humans didn't need 12 ships to handle the Vorai fleet. The Aegis Terra had been demonstrating that for the last few minutes on its own. The ships were not here because the Aegis needed help. They were here because this was the human statement. This was their clear and unambiguous statement that they were present. They were organized. They were here in large numbers. And what the galaxy was seeing now was not an exception. This was not one ship that decided to act. This was a fleet that had decided to step forward, back to the main collision. The Vorai fleet shrank to 9 mobile ships, then to 6, then to 4. The Aegis methodically worked through them. Engines gone, power plant dead, ships drifting. The Vorai were still firing. They seemed not to know how to stop, or could not bring themselves to stop, but their shots did exactly what all the previous shots had done, which was nothing. The last mobile Vorai ship tried to flee. It turned and pushed its engines to the max and headed for the edge of the system at full speed. The Aegis did not pursue. It wasn't necessary. One of the ships on the outer edge, one of the smaller ones 3 to 4 kilometers long, intercepted, matched the speed of the fleeing warship without apparent effort, took position directly in the Vorai ship's path, and simply waited. The Vorai ship had 2 options. It could fire on the human ship blocking its escape, which it did, and which had no effect, or it could stop. After 3 seconds of trying the first option and achieving nothing, it stopped. Saravel watched as the entire Vorai fleet sat dead or stationary in the Veret system, 20 warships going nowhere, and she thought about the old political debates she had listened to in council halls, about the long arguments over whether to send 2 ships or 3 to Vorai border incidents, whether to file a formal complaint or an informal one, whether committee review should precede action or follow it. She thought about how many colonies might have been saved otherwise if at any moment over the last 12 years someone had shown up and simply, systematically, and without malice or destruction, stripped the Vorai of their ability to go anywhere. The Aegis Terra stopped in the center of the drifting Vorai fleet. It was surrounded on all sides by warships that had fired everything they had, and none of it mattered. And now they all sat motionless. Pak's voice sounded again on the general channel. Vorai Fleet Command. Your ships are immobilized. No crew member has been harmed. We do not intend to destroy your vessels or harm your personnel. However, You are currently unable to leave the system until we permit it. Pause. We will send transport to the surface of Veret 4 to begin relief operations for the colony. During this time, we request you to sit quietly and think about the conversation we will have after the relief operations are completed. This conversation will include your withdrawal from all territories seized over the last 12 years, reparations to the affected colonies, and a formal agreement on future border conduct. Another pause, shorter this time. We are not asking you to surrender. We are asking you to negotiate. There is a difference. We think, given the current situation, you will find negotiations more comfortable than the alternative. The Vorai fleet said nothing. Saravel's comms console lit up. It was Pak on the direct channel to the Eternal Accord. Admiral Saravel, we are beginning operations on the surface of Veret 4. We have medical personnel and supply capabilities on board. We would appreciate it if the Council fleet could coordinate with us on the distribution of aid. Saravel looked at her bridge crew. They were all looking at her. She read on their faces every emotion she was experiencing herself. Shock, recalibration, an attempt to process the last 40 minutes and place them into a framework that made sense. There was no framework. Something completely new had just happened, and the old frameworks were not built to contain it. Commander Pak, she said into the channel. She kept her voice level. She was an admiral, and being an admiral meant certain things. We will coordinate relief operations. We have available medical teams. Thank you, Admiral. Commander, she paused. The ships at the edge of the system. Are they all human vessels? A brief pause. Yes, Admiral, he said. And there are others, beyond what is here. It wasn't exactly a question, but Pak answered it as if it were. She stared at the delay. 13 human warships in the Veret system, 20 immobilized Vorai ships going nowhere. A burning colony on the surface waiting for help that was now finally arriving. And somewhere beyond the mapped regions, more human ships. She exhaled slowly, then straightened in her chair. Begin relief coordination, she said to her crew. All departments cease combat readiness and prepare to assist in ground operations. They moved. They were good people, her crew. And they moved. Saravel looked one more time at the display, at the huge, dark outline of the Aegis Terra occupying the center of the system, as if it had always been there, as if it intended to stay. She thought about the galaxy she knew yesterday, about maps and borders and the carefully maintained balance of who had what and who wanted what. Then she thought about the galaxy she was sitting in now. They were not the same galaxies. She wasn't sure they would ever be the same galaxy again. Relief operations on Veret 4 took 31 hours. During that time, Saravel did not sleep. She wasn't sure if any of her bridge crew had. They took turns at their posts, coordinated with the human medical teams, and watched the huge vessels standing in the center of the system. And they thought their thoughts. And when they looked at each other, they shared that particular expression of people who had witnessed something that had forever restructured their understanding of the world. The human medical teams were thorough. It was the word Saravel kept returning to, thorough. They arrived on the surface on transports that descended from the Aegis's launch bays in groups of 4 and 6, and they brought with them not just medical personnel, but enough supplies that Saravel's logistics officer, a careful Dratari named Hiss, spent an entire hour cataloging what was unloaded, then came to Saravel with the catalog and said, "With the greatest precision, Admiral, they have brought enough medical material for a population approximately 3 times larger than this colony. It appears they prepared for this in advance." Saravel looked at the catalog and said, "Yes, I think they were prepared." This meant they knew about the situation on Veret before they arrived. This meant they had been watching closely enough to know not only that it was happening, but how bad it was, which meant the arrival time of the Aegis Terra was no coincidence. They had come specifically, deliberately, because they had decided, this is the moment, and this is the place. For 31 hours, the victims were stabilized. The fires were extinguished. The eastern settlements, the ones that had vanished from the sensor feed, were reached on the ground, and the human teams reported steadily to the coordination channel that Saravel's comms officer had established between the fleets. The reports contained numbers, medical terminology, and logistics data. But underneath it all was the same clear story. People who were dying were now being saved, and people who were afraid were now receiving help, and the colony of Veret 4 would survive this. On the second morning, negotiations began with the Vorai. Saravel was present for them, sitting at the table inside the large conference space on the Aegis Terra that probably hadn't existed before the delegation's first visit. It had, she suspected, been specifically configured with the right furniture for several different species and enough space for a significant number of representatives. The Vorai fleet commander came in person. He was large, as Vorai are, deep gray-green in color, solidly built, with a physical presence that came from a life spent in military command. He sat opposite Commander Pak and looked at him with the level, evaluating gaze of a man trying to read an opponent. Pak looked at him with the same quiet patience he had demonstrated in every interaction Saravel had observed so far. The Vorai commander's name was Gra. He had served in the Vorai military for 37 years. He had commanded 3 border operations, and this was his 4th. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Pak. He looked at Saravel. He looked at the table. Then he looked at his hands, as if consulting something, then looked at Pak again. "What do you want?" he said. "Withdrawal from all territories seized over the last 12 years, Pak said. His voice was the same as in every other conversation, clear, without malice or triumph. Complete withdrawal, not partial, not phased over 10 years, completed within 60 days. Standard mapping and census teams of the Council will verify compliance." Gra said nothing. "Reparations to the affected colonies," Pak continued. "The Council will set the sum. It will be paid. The Vorai government will be granted a reasonable time frame." Gra still said nothing. "And a formal, binding agreement on border conduct in the future, with verification mechanisms and significant consequences for violations. Consequences that will include us." Pak paused. The room was quiet. Gra looked at the table again. He looked like a man conducting a calculation. A man who had always been very good at calculations involving warships and firepower and fleet counts, and who could take what from whom, and who had now discovered that the calculation had a new variable that changed every answer he had ever arrived at. His ships outside were sitting motionless in space. Their engines were disabled. His crews were unharmed. His ships were intact. The humans had done all of this without killing a single Vorai soldier. And standing just beyond the mapped borders of the galactic community were even more human ships. How many more? No one at that table knew except for the calm man sitting opposite him. "You are asking me to sign away 12 years of territorial expansion," Gra said. His voice was low and not entirely angry, rather the voice of a man experiencing an unwanted reality. "Yes," Pak said, "on behalf of the Vorai government, which I do not represent here. You are the senior Vorai officer present in this system. The agreement you sign here will be transmitted to your government with our recommendation that it be carried out. The alternative is to transmit the sensor logs of this engagement to all governments of the galactic community and begin a formal discussion with the Council on border security measures that will include us." Pak's voice was still level, still patient. "We would prefer not to do that. We would prefer to give your government the opportunity to make this decision itself." Silence again. Gra looked at him for a long time. "You could have destroyed my fleet," he said finally. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact that was clearly what he had been sitting with since the end of the collision. "Yes," Pak said. "But you didn't know why we didn't." Pak thought about the question for a moment. When he answered, his voice was the same. But there was something in it that hadn't been in previous answers, something that was not quite heavy and not quite tired, but was somewhere in that area. "Because the goal is not to destroy," he said. "The goal is to stop the harm. Those are different things. You were here not because your soldiers are evil. You were here because your government was moving borders and no one was stopping it. We have stopped it. You do not need to be destroyed for that to be true." Gra was quiet for a long time after that. Then he signed the agreement. He signed it with a Vorai marker on a physical document that Pak's people had specially printed for this purpose. And when he finished signing, he leaned back and looked at the document and looked at Pak and said nothing more. He looked like a man who had just seen the map he had lived his entire career by replaced by another map, and who had not yet decided how he felt about living by the new map. Saravel understood the feeling. The Vorai fleet was released in groups over the next 6 hours. Pak's engineers, or whatever they were called, the technicians who had handled the engine disabling apparently prepared repair components for the Vorai engines during the negotiations, which was either a very practical gesture or a very deliberate one, and Saravel suspected it was both. The Vorai ships left the Veret system one by one. Their engines were restored, their crews were intact, their ships undamaged, except for the specific engine components that had been removed and then repaired. The Vorai fleet commander, leaving last on the unbroken hammer, sent one final message to the Aegis Terra. It read, "Accepted. Saravel thought that was probably the most honest thing the Vorai had said during the entire meeting. After the last Vorai ship left, she returned to the Aegis Terra one more time. Not for a crisis meeting, not for negotiations. Pak had asked her to come in a message that was short and unceremonious. And she came because she was sincerely, deeply intrigued, and because she had a hunch this conversation mattered the most. They sat in the same conference room as before, but this time they were alone. No delegations, no officers flanking them at the table. Pak poured something hot into 2 small containers from a dispenser on the wall and placed one in front of her. She looked at it. Tea, he said, specifically oolong. It is a human drink. It might not be to your taste, but it is what I have, and I offer what I have. She tried it. It was unusual. She couldn't say if she liked it. She tried it again. The council, she said, setting the container down, will have to meet with you. Yes, Pak said. High Counselor Dawn will want a full briefing. Other members of the council will have questions. Many questions. The presence of an unknown civilization with your capabilities will cause significant. She searched for the right word. Discussion. I assume, Pak said, there will be fear. Not everyone will react as I have. There are species in the council who will see your fleet and see a threat regardless of your intentions. I know, he said. He held the tea with both hands as she noticed humans did, as if the heat of the container was something they sought. We expected this. That is why we waited so long. We wanted to have something to offer, not just capabilities. We wanted to have a record of actions demonstrating intent. Today was a demonstration, she said. Today was the start of a demonstration, he said. She looked at him. How many ships, Commander? You put off the answer before. He looked at his tea, then looked up at her. When he spoke, his voice was the same, but there was something in it that wasn't in previous answers, something that was not quite heavy and not quite tired, but was somewhere in that area. Admiral, I will answer that question honestly, because you have been honest with me, and because the Council needs accurate information to make good decisions. He set the container down. Ships of the Titan class, ships the size of the Aegis and larger. The Council has already seen 13. There are others. She waited. Currently, 47 Titangent-class ships are in commission, he said. There are also support fleets, carrier groups, rapid response squadrons, logistics ships. The total number of human warships across all size classes numbers in the thousands. She sat with this. Thousands, not hundreds, not tens of thousands, but thousands. With ships in the size range, she had observed absorbing the barrage of 20 warships without effect. Built over 300 years of quiet preparation while the galactic community conducted its committees and debates and cautious political balancing. And she thought this was the complete picture of what the galaxy contained. You would never have been under threat, she said quietly. At any moment over the last 300 years, no species in the community could have threatened you. There are always threats, Pak said. Some of them are not other civilizations. He paused. Some of what we encountered beyond the mapped regions in the early years of exploration was more dangerous than anything in the galactic community. That is why we built what we built, not because we were afraid of you. She thought about what that meant about what was beyond the mapped regions, about 300 years of human ships moving in the dark beyond the known galaxy. Having faced something that required 47 Titangent-class ships as a final answer, she found she did not want to ask about it today. There was enough to process already. I will submit your application for council membership, she said. I will provide a full briefing to High Counselor Dawn. I will recommend that the council accept your delegation and process the application. She looked at him. I cannot predict the outcome. The council is complex. All governing bodies are complex, Pak said. He almost smiled. We have been observing your council for a long time, Admiral. We are prepared for complexity. She stood up. He stood up. She looked at him across the table. This calm, patient man with dark eyes and a voice that spoke to 20 armed warships, a panicking Vorai fleet commander, and a Galactic Council admiral with the same unhurried, confident certainty as if the outcome had never been in serious doubt. She extended her hand. He shook it. Welcome, she said to the Galactic Community commander. Officially, something changed in his expression, something small and sincere, without the practiced controllability she had seen since the first moment in the conference room. Just for a moment, he did not look like a commander, but like a person who had waited for something for a very long time and finally achieved it. Thank you, Admiral, he said. She left the Aegis Terra for the second time and crossed the gap back to the Eternal Accord on the shuttle, and she sat in the front passenger seat and looked out the viewport at the stars. And she thought about the report she would have to write. She thought about what to write in the report when the most significant first contact event in the history of the galactic community had just occurred in a system most council members couldn't find on a map. She thought about how High Counselor Dawn would read it. She thought about every star she could see, and the knowledge that was now firmly settled in her understanding of things, that somewhere out there in the dark beyond the maps, those stars were not empty. They had never been empty. There were ships, thousands of ships over 300 years, and none of them knew. The shuttle docked. She entered the Eternal Accord. Her bridge crew was there. All of them, even those who were technically off duty and should have been asleep. They were standing at their stations or sitting at consoles they didn't need to be at, and they were looking at the display screens showing the Veret system, showing the Aegis Terra, showing the distant shapes of the other 12 human ships at the edge of the system. They looked at her when she entered. She looked back at them. "Give me a comms line to the Council High Command," she said. "Priority 1. I need to speak with the Counselor." She went to her command chair and sat down. "And send a message to Commander Pak. Tell him we will be in contact regarding the official procedures for introduction to the Council." Her comms officer opened the priority line. Her crew moved at their posts. Outside the viewport of the Eternal Accord, the Aegis Terra sat calmly in the Veret system. Running lights moved slowly across 11 kilometers of dark hull in the starlight. Patient, present, waiting for the galaxy to catch up. When High Counselor Dawn's face appeared on the comms screen, still calm, still silver blue, still with that carefully neutral expression, Saravel looked at him and thought about how exactly to begin. She said, "Counselor, I need you to open a new file in the Council Registry. The name of the entry will be Humanity, and I need you to clear your schedule for the next few days. What I'm about to tell you will take some time." The face of the High Counselor, carefully calculated, shifted slightly. Just a little, just enough. Saravel allowed herself for one short moment the smallest version of what could have been a smile. Then she began her report. And in the Veret system, 300 years of silence had finally come to an end.